The shot rang out just as Adelaide Kane ducked behind the rain barrel, splinters from the wooden fence post exploding into the night air where her head had been seconds before. She pressed her trembling body against the cold metal, her breath coming in ragged gasps as footsteps thundered past her hiding spot in the alley behind the Independence, Missouri Mercantile. The autumn of 1873 had turned deadly in ways she never could have imagined when she had accepted the teaching position in this frontier town 3 months ago. Now, the man she had witnessed commit murder wanted her silenced permanently, and he had the sheriff in his pocket. Adelaide waited in the darkness, her green eyes wide with terror as she listened to the searchers move away down the street. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins during her desperate flight, hanging in tangled waves around her pale face. She was only 22 years old, and until tonight, the most dangerous thing she had encountered in Independence was an unruly student refusing to memorize his multiplication tables. Now she crouched in the mud behind a rain barrel, knowing that if Wallace Hendricks found her, she would disappear like the 3 other people who had seen too much and tried to speak up. She had been walking home from the schoolhouse late, having stayed to prepare lessons for the following week, when she heard the argument behind the saloon. The voices had been raised in anger, and she had frozen on the boardwalk, uncertain whether to continue past or turn back. Then came the unmistakable sound of a gunshot, followed by a heavy thud. Adelaide had peered around the corner just as Wallace Hendricks stepped into the lamplight, a smoking revolver in his hand and the body of a ranch hand named Samuel Turner at his feet. Their eyes had met across the distance, and Adelaide's blood had turned to ice. Wallace Hendricks owned half the businesses in Independence and controlled the other half through loans and intimidation. The sheriff, corrupt to his core, was nothing more than Hendricks' hired gun with a badge. Adelaide had seen the calculation in Hendricks' cold blue eyes, watched him gesture to 2 of his men, and then she had run. That was 2 hours ago. Now she shivered in the October cold, wearing only her teaching dress and a thin shawl, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The boarding house where she rented a room was surely being watched. The school would be the first place they would look tomorrow. She had a little money saved, but nothing that would get her far enough away fast enough. The sound of horses approaching made her shrink further into the shadows. She heard men's voices, rough and impatient. "Boss says she could not have gotten far on foot," one man growled. "A school teacher. She will be hiding somewhere close, scared as a rabbit. We have checked every building on Main Street," another voice responded. "Maybe she made it out to one of the farms. Then we ride out and check them. Hendricks wants this finished tonight." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes as the hopelessness of her situation crashed over her. Even if she managed to avoid capture tonight, where would she go? How long could she survive out in the wilderness with no supplies, no horse, and winter approaching? But staying meant death, and she was not ready to die. When the voices finally faded, she forced herself to move. Her legs were cramped and unsteady, but she made herself creep out of her hiding place and move deeper into the maze of alleys behind the main buildings. She headed toward the edge of town, where the scattered homesteads and ranches began. Maybe she could find a barn to hide in or steal a horse if desperation demanded it. The thought made her feel ill. She had never stolen anything in her life, had always followed every rule and expectation placed upon her. Now none of that mattered. Only survival mattered. The moon had risen higher by the time she reached the outskirts of Independence, casting long shadows across the rutted road that led west into ranch country. Adelaide stumbled along, trying to stay off the road itself, moving through the scrub grass and scattered trees. Her shoes were meant for wooden floors and boardwalks, not rough terrain, and she could feel blisters forming with each step. She must have walked for an hour when exhaustion finally overcame fear. Her legs simply gave out, and she sank down beneath a stand of cottonwood trees, her body shaking with cold and shock. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to think, tried to form some kind of plan, but her mind felt scattered and useless. That was when she heard the rider. The horse was moving at a steady pace along the road, its hoofbeats rhythmic in the quiet night. Adelaide pressed herself flat against the ground, praying the shadows would hide her. She held her breath as the rider came closer, then past her hiding spot. She caught a glimpse of a tall figure in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, a bedroll and saddlebag secured behind the saddle. Just a traveler, she thought, and allowed herself to breathe again. But then the horse stopped. Adelaide's heart hammered in her chest as she heard the creak of leather, the soft thud of boots hitting the ground. Had he seen her? Was he one of Hendricks' men after all? "I know someone is out here." The voice was deep and calm, with none of the threatening edge she had heard from her pursuers earlier. "If you are in trouble, I can help. If you are planning to rob me, I should tell you I do not have much worth taking, but I am a fair shot and would rather not have to prove it." Adelaide stayed silent, frozen with indecision. Could this be a trap? But what choice did she have? "I heard about the trouble in town tonight," the man continued. "Heard Wallace Hendricks is looking for someone, a woman. Now I find a woman hiding out here in the cold and the dark, and I am thinking maybe those two things are connected." Something in his tone, a gentleness beneath the matter-of-fact words, made Adelaide's decision for her. She slowly pushed herself up to sitting, every muscle protesting. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse and broken. "Please help me. He is going to kill me." The man turned toward her, and in the moonlight she could make out strong features and dark eyes beneath the brim of his hat. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with broad shoulders and the lean, weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her disheveled appearance and obvious fear. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Adelaide said, though in truth she had only ridden a handful of times in her life and never bareback or at speed. "Then we need to move. If Hendricks has men out searching, they will be covering all the roads out of town." He walked over to her and extended his hand. "My name is Thomas Carson. I have a ranch about 15 miles west of here. You will be safe there tonight, and then we can figure out what comes next." Adelaide took his hand, feeling the callous strength in his grip as he pulled her to her feet. "Adelaide Kane," she whispered. "I am a schoolteacher. I saw him kill a man tonight, and he knows I saw." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he simply nodded. "Then we ride hard and fast. Can you hold on behind me?" "I will have to," Adelaide said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Thomas led her to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood calmly despite the stranger approaching. He swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, then extended his arm down to her. Adelaide grasped it and managed to scramble up behind him, her skirts bunching awkwardly. She had never sat astride a horse before, had always used a side saddle on her rare rides, and the impropriety would have mortified her under normal circumstances. Now, she simply wrapped her arms around Thomas's waist and held on. "There is a blanket in my bedroll if you can reach it," Thomas said over his shoulder. "You are shaking like a leaf." Adelaide managed to work the blanket free with one hand while keeping her other arm locked around him. She draped it over her shoulders as best she could, grateful for even this small warmth. Then Thomas urged the horse forward, not at a reckless gallop but at a steady, ground-eating lope that carried them away from Independence and into the dark prairie beyond. Adelaide clung to him, feeling the solid strength of his back against her cheek, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the confident way he sat his horse. For the first time in hours, she felt something other than pure terror. She felt a tiny spark of hope. They rode for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably less than an hour. Thomas kept them off the main roads, following what seemed to be cattle trails and creek beds through the darkness. He handled his horse with the ease of someone born to it, never hesitating even when the moonlight barely penetrated the clouds that had begun to gather overhead. Finally, lights appeared in the distance. As they drew closer, Adelaide could make out the shapes of buildings: a house, a barn, several outbuildings and corrals. The ranch was modest but well-maintained. Even in the darkness she could sense that. Thomas guided the horse up to the barn and dismounted, then helped Adelaide down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, stiff from the ride and weak from exhaustion. "Easy," Thomas said, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "Let me get my horse settled, then I will get you inside and warmed up." Adelaide nodded mutely, watching as he led the bay into the barn. She could hear him moving around inside, the comfortable sounds of a man caring for his animal. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and looked toward the house. It was a simple structure, probably just a few rooms, but it looked sturdy and well-built. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone had kept a fire burning. Thomas emerged from the barn and gestured toward the house. "Come on, you look about ready to collapse." He was not wrong. Adelaide followed him on unsteady feet, climbing the 2 steps to the porch and waiting while he opened the door. Warmth rushed out to greet her, and she nearly sobbed with relief. The interior was simple but clean. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall where embers still glowed. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. The furniture was handmade but solid, the floor swept, everything orderly and functional. "Sit," Thomas said, pointing to a chair near the fireplace. He moved to build up the fire, adding logs and stirring the embers until flames began to lick upward. "When did you last eat?" Adelaide had to think about that. "Lunch," she said finally. "Maybe around noon." Thomas went to the kitchen area and began pulling out bread, cheese, and cold meat. "It is not much, but it will do for now." He set the food on the table along with a cup of water from a pitcher. "Eat. I will make coffee." Adelaide wanted to protest that he should not wait on her, but she was too hungry and too tired. She moved to the table and began to eat, her hands shaking as she lifted the bread to her mouth. The food was simple but good, and she had not realized how famished she was until that first bite. Thomas worked in silence, putting coffee on to boil, adding more wood to the fire. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and brought one to the table, settling into the chair across from her. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. Adelaide wrapped her hands around the warm cup and took a shaky breath. Then she told him everything, from hearing the argument behind the saloon to witnessing the murder to her desperate flight through Independence. Thomas listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady on her face, his expression growing grimmer as the story unfolded. "Samuel Turner," he said when she finished. "I knew him slightly. He worked for the Double Bar Ranch east of town. Good man from what I heard." "What do you suppose he did to cross Hendricks?" "I do not know," Adelaide said, "but I heard Hendricks say something before he pulled the trigger. He said, 'You should have kept your mouth shut about the cattle.' That is all I caught." Thomas nodded slowly. "There have been rumors of rustling. Cattle disappearing from several ranches, including the Double Bar. Maybe Turner saw something he should not have." "And now I have done the same," Adelaide said, her voice breaking. "What am I going to do? I cannot go back to Independence. Hendricks owns that town." "You can stay here," Thomas said simply. At least until we figure something out." Adelaide looked at him, this stranger who had appeared out of the darkness and offered help without hesitation. "Why would you do that? You do not know me. This could bring trouble to your door." "Probably will bring trouble to my door," Thomas agreed. "But that does not change what is right. You need help, and I am in a position to give it. That is all the reason I need." Something in Adelaide's chest loosened at his words, and she felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how I will ever repay you." "I do not need repayment," Thomas said. He stood and moved toward one of the doors. "This is my room, but you will sleep here tonight. I will take the spare room. The bed is clean, and you will find everything you need. Tomorrow we will work on getting you some proper clothes and supplies." "I cannot take your room," Adelaide protested, but Thomas waved off her objection. "You can and you will. You have been through hell tonight and you need proper rest." "I will be fine." He paused in the doorway. "There is a bolt on the inside of the door. Use it. Not because you need to fear me, but because you need to feel safe." "Understood," Adelaide nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "Good night then, Miss Kane. Try to sleep. Things will look clearer in the morning." He closed the door behind him, and Adelaide heard his footsteps moving to the other room. She sat at the table for a few more minutes, finishing her coffee and trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. Her entire life had been upended in a single evening. The respectable schoolteacher she had been this morning no longer existed. In her place was a fugitive, dependent on the charity of a stranger and with no clear path forward. Finally, she rose and went into Thomas's room. It was as simple as the rest of the house. A bed covered with a quilt, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a pitcher and basin. Everything was neat and orderly. She noticed a tintype photograph on the dresser, showing a young couple standing stiffly for the camera. Thomas's parents, perhaps. Adelaide washed her face and hands as best she could with the cold water in the pitcher, then sat on the edge of the bed to remove her ruined shoes. Her stockings were torn and muddy, her feet blistered and sore. She would need new everything, she realized. All her possessions were back in her boarding house room, and she could never retrieve them. She slid beneath the quilt and pulled it up to her chin, feeling the softness of the mattress beneath her aching body. For the first time since fleeing through the streets of Independence, she allowed herself to fully relax, and the tears she had been holding back finally came. She cried silently into the pillow, mourning the loss of the life she had built here, grieving for Samuel Turner who had died simply for knowing too much, and releasing the terror that had carried her this far. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When Adelaide woke, sunlight was streaming through the window and she could smell bacon cooking. For a moment she was disoriented, unable to remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back and she sat up quickly, her heart racing. She could hear Thomas moving around in the main room, the clatter of pans and dishes. Adelaide looked down at herself, at her wrinkled and stained dress, and felt a wave of embarrassment. She had no other clothes, no brush for her tangled hair, nothing. But she could not hide in this room forever, so she stood and did her best to straighten her appearance, finger-combing her hair and pinning it back up as neatly as she could manage. When she emerged from the bedroom, Thomas was at the stove, tending to a pan of eggs. He looked up as she entered and gave her a slight smile. "Good morning. I hope you slept." "I did, thank you," Adelaide said. She felt suddenly shy, acutely aware of being alone with a man she barely knew, of the impropriety of the entire situation. But propriety seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. "Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." Thomas brought plates to the table, loaded with bacon, eggs, and biscuits. "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage the basics." Adelaide sat and realized she was ravenous again. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Thomas spoke. "I have been thinking about your situation," he said. "I need to ride into town today to pick up some supplies. I will keep my ears open, see what people are saying, what Hendricks is up to." "Is that safe?" Adelaide asked, alarm rising in her chest. "What if someone saw you help me last night?" "No one saw," Thomas assured her. "And I have legitimate business in town. I go every week or two. If I suddenly stopped, that would look more suspicious than if I just carry on as normal." Adelaide saw the logic in that, but she still felt uneasy. "What should I do while you are gone?" "Stay here. Stay inside. Do not go outside where anyone might see you from the road. I doubt anyone will come by, but if they do, hide. There is a root cellar behind the house with an entrance in the kitchen floor." He pointed to a section of floorboards that did not quite match the others. "If you hear riders approaching, get down there and stay quiet." The thought of hiding in a cellar made Adelaide's skin crawl, but she nodded. "I understand. Good, I will be back before dark." Thomas finished his breakfast and stood. "There are books on the shelf if you want something to do. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen. Just stay out of sight." After Thomas left, the house felt very large and very quiet. Adelaide cleaned up the breakfast dishes, then explored the main room more thoroughly. The books were a mix of practical guides on ranching and animal husbandry, a few novels that looked well worn, and a Bible. She selected one of the novels and settled into the chair by the fireplace, but found she could not concentrate on the words. Instead, her mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. She kept seeing Wallace Hendricks' face as he turned toward her, the cold calculation in his eyes. She kept hearing the gunshot, seeing Samuel Turner fall, and she kept wondering what was happening in Independence right now. Was her disappearance the talk of the town? Had they found her room empty and ransacked it looking for clues? The morning stretched into afternoon. Adelaide made herself some lunch from the supplies in the kitchen, then returned to her attempt at reading. She was actually starting to lose herself in the story when she heard the sound of horses outside. Her blood turned to ice. She set the book aside carefully and moved to the window, peering out from behind the curtain. 3 riders were approaching the house, and even from a distance, she could see they were not friendly neighbors paying a social call. Adelaide ran to the kitchen and found the section of floor Thomas had indicated. She worked her fingers under the edge and lifted, revealing a ladder leading down into darkness. She climbed down quickly, pulling the trapdoor closed above her head, and found herself in complete blackness. The root cellar smelled of earth and stored vegetables. Adelaide felt her way carefully, finding sacks of potatoes and onions, barrels that probably held apples or other provisions. She moved to the far corner and crouched down, making herself as small as possible, and waited. Above, she heard heavy footsteps on the porch, then loud knocking on the door. When no one answered, the knocking became pounding. Then she heard the door open and boots on the wooden floor. "Nobody home," a rough voice said. "Spread out, check the place." Adelaide held her breath as footsteps moved through the house above her. She heard drawers being opened, furniture being moved. The men were searching thoroughly, looking for any sign of her presence. "Check the barn and outbuildings," another voice ordered. "If she was here, there will be some trace." The footsteps moved away, and Adelaide heard the front door close. She stayed frozen in her hiding place, counting her heartbeats, fighting against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, she heard horses leaving, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. She waited longer, terrified they might have left someone behind to watch the house. Her legs were cramping from crouching in the same position, but she did not dare move. Only when she was certain they had been gone for at least an hour did she finally climb back up the ladder and push open the trapdoor. The main room was a mess. Drawers had been pulled out, their contents scattered. Cushions had been thrown from chairs. The searchers had been thorough but not destructive. They had been looking for evidence, not trying to send a message. Adelaide's hands shook as she began to straighten the room, putting things back where she thought they belonged. She was still working on it when she heard a single horse approaching. She froze, listening intently, then nearly collapsed with relief when she recognized Thomas's bay. He came through the door and took in the scene immediately. They were here. 3 men, Adelaide said, her voice trembling. They searched the house and the outbuildings. I hid in the cellar like you said. Thomas's jaw tightened. I was afraid of this. Word is all over town that you have disappeared. Hendricks is offering a reward for information about your whereabouts. How much? Adelaide asked. $50. Adelaide sank into a chair. $50 was a fortune to most people in these parts, enough to make even honest folks think twice about keeping their mouths shut if they saw something suspicious. Did you learn anything else? She asked. Thomas set down the supplies he had brought from town and pulled out a chair across from her. Samuel Turner's body was found this morning behind the saloon. The official story is that he was drunk and got into a fight. No witnesses, of course. That is a lie, Adelaide said fiercely. He was not drunk. He was murdered in cold blood. I know that, and you know that, but proving it is another matter entirely. Thomas ran a hand through his dark hair. I did hear one interesting thing, though. Turner had been talking to a U.S. Marshal last week. A man named Jack Crawford who has been investigating the rustling in this area. Crawford was supposed to meet with Turner again this week. Do you think that is why Hendricks killed him? Adelaide asked. To stop him from talking to the marshal. That would be my guess. Which means this is bigger than just one murder. Hendricks is involved in something serious enough to kill to protect it. We need to find this Marshal Crawford, Adelaide said. He needs to know what I saw. Agreed, but we need to be careful about how we do it. Crawford is staying at the hotel in Independence, right in Hendricks' territory. We cannot just walk up and tell him what you witnessed. So what do we do? Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. I have a friend who might be able to help. Dan Robertson. He has a ranch about 20 miles north of here. Good man, honest, and he has no love for Wallace Hendricks. Hendricks tried to buy his land a few years back and got ugly when Dan refused to sell. You think he would help us? I think he would at least give us advice. And his ranch is far enough from Independence that we might be able to move around more freely up there. Thomas looked at her steadily. It would mean another long ride, probably leaving before dawn to avoid being seen on the road. Are you up for that? Adelaide thought about the alternative, which was hiding in this house indefinitely while Hendricks' men searched the countryside for her. I am up for it, she said. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning before first light. We will pack tonight and get a few hours of sleep. Thomas stood and began unpacking the supplies he had brought. I got some things you will need, clothes that will be more practical than that dress. They belong to my mother. She died 3 years ago, but I kept some of her things. He pulled out a simple cotton dress, a warm shawl, sturdy boots, and undergarments. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes at his thoughtfulness. Thank you, she said softly, for all of this. I still do not understand why you are helping me. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes serious. When I was 16, my father was killed by a man who wanted our land. The man was wealthy and well-connected, and he made sure there were no witnesses. My mother and I knew he was guilty, but we could not prove it. We had to watch him walk free while my father lay in the ground. Adelaide's breath caught. I am so sorry. I swore then that if I was ever in a position to help someone facing that kind of injustice, I would do it. You are in that position now, Miss Kane. So I am keeping my promise to my 16-year-old self." He managed a small smile. "Besides, I do not much care for men like Wallace Hendricks thinking they can do whatever they want just because they have money and influence." "Please call me Adelaide," she said. "I think we are past formal titles at this point." "Adelaide," Thomas said, testing out her name. "And you can call me Thomas." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the journey. Thomas packed supplies and checked his weapons, cleaning and loading his rifle and revolver. Adelaide tried on the clothes he had provided and was relieved to find they fit reasonably well, though she had to roll up the sleeves and hem of the dress. His mother must have been slightly taller and broader than her slender frame. As evening fell, they ate a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. Adelaide found herself watching Thomas as he moved around the kitchen, noting the economical grace of his movements, the quiet confidence he carried. He was different from any man she had known before. The men in her life had been her father, a strict minister who believed in rules and propriety above all else, and the few suitors who had called on her in Baltimore, all of them concerned with their own advancement and status. Thomas seemed unconcerned with any of that. He lived simply, worked hard, and operated according to a code of ethics that was written on his heart rather than in any book. There was a steadiness to him that she found deeply comforting in the chaos her life had become. "You are staring," Thomas said without looking up from the pot he was stirring. Adelaide felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize, I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how different you are from the men I knew back in Baltimore, before I came west to teach." "Different how?" Adelaide considered that. "More real, I suppose, less concerned with appearances and more focused on substance." Thomas smiled slightly. "Life out here does not leave much room for pretense. You have to be who you are because there is nobody around to impress and no point in trying." "Do you like it, living out here alone, most of the time?" Thomas said. "I have the land, my cattle, the horses. I answer to nobody but myself. But it gets lonely sometimes, I will not lie about that." "Did you never want to marry?" Adelaide asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I am sorry, that is none of my business." "It is all right," Thomas said. "The truth is, I have not met many women out here. The ones I have met were either already married or looking for a very different kind of man than I am. Someone more settled, maybe. Someone who lives in town instead of out on a ranch miles from anywhere." "I cannot imagine wanting to live in town after this," Adelaide said. "The peace and quiet here, the space. It feels like I can breathe for the first time in months." Thomas looked at her thoughtfully. "You might change your mind once you have been here longer. Teaching school is one thing. Living on a ranch is another. It is hard work and long days, and sometimes you do not see another soul for weeks." "It sounds perfect," Adelaide said honestly. They fell into a comfortable silence, finishing their dinner and cleaning up together. As darkness settled fully over the ranch, Thomas showed Adelaide how to bar the door and check the windows. Then he banked the fire and wished her good night. Adelaide returned to his bedroom, which he insisted she keep using, and changed into a simple nightgown he had provided. She lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. Tomorrow they would ride to Dan Robertson's ranch, and she would be trusting her life to the kindness of yet another stranger. But as she thought about Thomas in the next room, standing guard over her safety, she realized she did not feel like he was a stranger anymore. In the space of just one day, he had become something else. A protector, a friend, maybe, whispered a small voice in her heart, something more. She pushed that thought away firmly. Now was not the time for such feelings. She needed to focus on staying alive and bringing Wallace Hendricks to justice. Everything else would have to wait. Adelaide finally fell asleep thinking of dark eyes and calloused hands, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she dreamed of something other than gunfire and running. The rooster's crow woke her while it was still dark outside. Adelaide dressed quickly in the practical riding clothes Thomas had given her, braiding her hair tightly and pinning it close to her head. When she emerged from the bedroom, Thomas already had coffee made and was packing the last of their supplies into saddlebags. "We will eat a quick breakfast, then head out," he said. "I want to be well away from here before there is enough light for anyone to see us from the road." They ate cold biscuits and drank strong coffee standing up, too tense to sit. Then Thomas led the way out to the barn where he saddled 2 horses, his bay gelding and a smaller sorrel mare. "This is Rosie," he said, introducing Adelaide to the mare. "She is gentle and sure-footed. Just give her her head and she will take care of you." Adelaide approached the mare nervously, running her hand along the smooth neck. "Hello, Rosie. Please be patient with me. I am not much of a rider." "You will be fine," Thomas assured her. He helped her mount, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs and making sure she was comfortable. Then he swung onto his own horse, and they set out into the pre-dawn darkness. The ride was easier than Adelaide had expected. Rosie was as gentle as Thomas had promised, responding to the lightest touch on the reins. Thomas set a steady pace, not too fast but purposeful, and Adelaide found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride. As the sky began to lighten in the east, she looked around at the landscape they were passing through. Rolling prairie stretched in all directions, dotted with stands of trees along creek beds and occasional rock outcroppings. It was beautiful in its vastness, in the way the land seemed to go on forever under the enormous sky. "It is lovely out here," she said to Thomas, who rode slightly ahead of her. He glanced back with a smile. "Wait until you see it in spring when everything is green and wildflowers cover the hills. That is when it really comes alive." "I hope I am still here to see it," Adelaide said quietly. "You will be," Thomas said with conviction. "We are going to sort this out, Adelaide. I promise you that." They rode in silence for a while longer, the sun slowly rising behind them and painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. Adelaide found herself studying Thomas's back as he rode, noticing the way he sat his horse with unconscious ease, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his coat. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted taking on her troubles. Around mid-morning they stopped to rest the horses and eat some of the food Thomas had packed. They sat in the shade of a rocky outcropping, sharing jerky and dried apples while the horses grazed nearby. "How much farther?" Adelaide asked. "Another 3 hours, maybe. We are making good time." Thomas looked at her carefully. "How are you holding up? Are you sore?" "A little," Adelaide admitted, "but I am managing. Let me know if you need to stop. There is no point in pushing too hard and arriving unable to walk." They set out again after the horses had rested, and Adelaide tried to focus on the landscape around them rather than her growing discomfort. Her muscles were protesting the unaccustomed exercise, and she knew she would be paying for this ride tomorrow. But she gritted her teeth and kept going. Finally, in the early afternoon, buildings appeared in the distance. As they drew closer, Adelaide could see that Dan Robertson's ranch was considerably larger than Thomas's, with multiple barns and corrals and what looked like bunkhouses for ranch hands. A man emerged from the main house as they rode up, tall and gray-haired with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes. He broke into a smile when he recognized Thomas. "Thomas Carson, as I live and breathe. What brings you all the way up here?" Then his eyes landed on Adelaide and his expression turned curious. Thomas dismounted and helped Adelaide down from Rosie. "Dan, this is Adelaide Kane. We need your help and we need your discretion." Dan's expression sobered immediately. "Come inside. You both look like you could use some coffee and a hot meal." They followed him into a comfortable ranch house that showed clear signs of a woman's touch. A pleasant-faced woman with brown hair streaked with gray emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thomas, what a lovely surprise, and you have brought a friend." She smiled warmly at Adelaide. "This is my wife, Margaret," Dan said. "Maggie, these folks need our help." Over coffee and fresh bread with butter, Thomas explained the situation. Adelaide filled in the details of what she had witnessed, and by the time they finished, both Dan and Margaret looked grim. "Wallace Hendricks," Dan said, shaking his head. "I wish I could say I was surprised, but that man has been dirty for years. The problem is proving it." "That is where the marshal comes in," Thomas said. "Jack Crawford was working with Samuel Turner on the rustling investigation. Adelaide needs to tell him what she saw, but we cannot risk going back to Independence." "Crawford is not in Independence anymore," Dan said. "He left 2 days ago, headed up to Kansas City to follow up on some lead. He is not expected back for at least a week." Adelaide's heart sank. "A week? I cannot hide for a week. Hendricks has men searching everywhere." "You can hide here," Margaret said firmly. "We have guest rooms, and this ranch is big enough that one more person will not be noticed by anyone who does not need to know about it." "Maggie is right," Dan agreed. "You will be safe here. And when Crawford gets back, I will personally escort you to meet with him. I know the marshal. He is a good man, honest. He will listen to what you have to say." "We cannot impose on you like this," Adelaide protested, but Margaret waved her objection away. "Nonsense. We have plenty of room and would be happy for the company. Besides, anyone who stands up to Wallace Hendricks has my respect and my support." She turned to Thomas. "You will stay too, of course." Thomas glanced at Adelaide, a question in his eyes. She gave a small nod and he turned back to Dan and Margaret. "We appreciate it more than we can say." "Then it is settled," Margaret said, standing. "Let me show you to your rooms so you can freshen up. Dinner will be ready in a few hours." Adelaide followed Margaret down a hallway to a pleasant room with a large window overlooking the ranch yard. The bed was covered with a colorful quilt, and there was a washstand with clean towels and a vase of dried flowers on the dresser. "There is water in the pitcher, and if you need anything at all, just ask," Margaret said. "You are safe here, dear. Try to rest." When Margaret had left, Adelaide sank onto the bed and let out a long breath. Safe. The word seemed almost foreign to her now. But as she looked around the cozy room and thought about the kind people who had offered her shelter, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. A soft knock on the door made her look up. Thomas stood in the doorway, looking uncertain. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I know the last few days have been overwhelming." "I am as all right as I can be, I suppose," Adelaide said. "Thanks to you." Thomas stepped into the room, leaving the door open for propriety's sake. "Dan and Maggie are good people. You really will be safe here. I know, I can feel it." Adelaide stood and crossed to where he stood. "Thomas, I have been thinking. Once I speak to Marshal Crawford and he investigates Hendricks, you might be implicated in all of this. Hendricks will know someone helped me, and it will not be hard for him to figure out who." "I thought of that," Thomas said calmly. "I am not worried. You should be. He killed a man for knowing too much. What would he do to someone who helped his witness escape?" "Let me worry about that," Thomas said. "Right now, the important thing is keeping you safe and making sure your testimony reaches the right people." Adelaide looked up at him, at the steady determination in his dark eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. This man had risked everything to help her, had asked for nothing in return, had shown her nothing but kindness and protection. And somewhere in the midst of running for her life and hiding from danger, she had started to fall in love with him. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Of course she was falling in love with Thomas Carson. How could she not? "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked softly, and Adelaide realized she had been staring at him. "I am thinking that I am very grateful you came along that road when you did," she said, which was true even if it was not the whole truth. Thomas smiled, and for a moment something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell. "Rest," he said. "I will see you at dinner." After he left, Adelaide washed her face and hands, then lay down on the bed. Despite everything, she felt lighter than she had in days. She was safe, at least for now. She had a plan, a path forward, and she had Thomas. That last thought carried her into sleep, and this time her dreams were full of dark eyes and gentle hands, of vast prairies and endless skies, of a future that might actually be possible. The week that followed took on a strange quality, like existing in a bubble outside of normal time. Adelaide helped Margaret with household tasks, finding comfort in the simple routines of cooking and cleaning and mending. Margaret was easy company, full of stories about ranch life and the early days of her marriage to Dan. Thomas spent his days helping Dan with ranch work, riding out to check on cattle or repairing fences. But every evening he sought out Adelaide, and they would walk together around the ranch yard or sit on the porch and talk as the sun set. Adelaide learned that Thomas had been raised on his family's ranch, that he loved the land with a passion that went bone deep. She learned that he had taught himself to read from his mother's books, that he had a gift for handling horses, that he dreamed of one day expanding his small operation into something more substantial. Thomas learned that Adelaide had grown up in Baltimore, the daughter of a stern minister who believed education was wasted on women. She had fought for every book she read, every lesson she learned, until finally she had qualified as a teacher and headed west to make her own way. She told him about her love of learning, her belief that education could change lives, her hope of one day running her own school. They talked about everything and nothing, and with each conversation, Adelaide felt herself falling deeper. She caught herself watching for him during the day, her heart lifting when he rode in from the range. She noticed small things, like the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he handled the horses, the respectful way he spoke to Margaret and the ranch hands. And she was almost certain he felt the same way. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch. His hand would linger on her elbow when he helped her over rough ground. He found excuses to be near her, to talk to her, to make her laugh. But neither of them spoke of it. The danger still hanging over Adelaide's head made any talk of feelings seem premature, inappropriate. They existed in this strange liminal space, caring for each other but unable to act on it. On the 5th day of their stay, Dan received word that Marshal Crawford had returned to Independence. The next morning, Dan, Thomas, and Adelaide rode out before dawn, heading for a meeting point Crawford had agreed to outside of town. They met the marshal at an abandoned line shack about 10 miles from Independence. Jack Crawford was a weathered man in his 40s with sharp gray eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to Adelaide's story without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she described witnessing Samuel Turner's murder. When she finished, he sat back and fixed her with a penetrating stare. "You are certain it was Wallace Hendricks who pulled the trigger?" "Completely certain," Adelaide said firmly. "I saw his face clearly in the lamplight. And you heard him mention cattle before the shooting?" "Yes. He said Turner should have kept his mouth shut about the cattle." Crawford nodded slowly. "That fits with what Turner was telling me." He had evidence that Hendricks was behind the rustling, using his position to fence stolen cattle through his businesses in Independence and Kansas City. Turner was going to testify to what he knew. "So, what happens now?" Thomas asked. "Now I take this back to the territorial court," Crawford said. "Miss Kane's testimony, combined with what Turner told me before he died, should be enough to get a warrant for Hendricks' arrest." "Should be?" Adelaide asked nervously. "Hendricks has connections," Crawford said bluntly. "He has money and influence, and he will use both to try to make this go away. But I have been building a case against him for months. This might be the piece that finally brings him down." "How long will it take?" Thomas asked. "A few weeks, maybe. I need to coordinate with the court, get the warrant issued, and arrange for enough men to arrest Hendricks safely. He will not go quietly." "What should Adelaide do in the meantime?" Dan asked. "Stay hidden," Crawford said. "Hendricks does not know where you are right now, and I want to keep it that way. Once I have him in custody, you will be safe. But until then, you need to stay out of sight." They talked for a while longer, Crawford taking detailed notes about everything Adelaide had seen and heard. Finally, he stood and shook hands with all of them. "You did the right thing coming forward, Miss Kane," he said. "I know it took courage." "I hope it is enough," Adelaide said quietly. "It will be. Trust me on that." The ride back to Dan and Margaret's ranch was subdued. Adelaide felt drained, emotionally exhausted from reliving the night of the murder. Thomas rode close beside her, not speaking but offering silent support with his presence. That evening, Adelaide found herself on the porch again, staring out at the sunset. She heard Thomas's footsteps behind her and made room for him on the bench. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Strange," Adelaide said. "Relieved that Crawford believes me, frightened about what comes next, exhausted from all of it." "It is almost over," Thomas said. "Soon Hendricks will be behind bars, and you will be free to live your life again." Adelaide thought about that, about the life she had been living before all this happened. Teaching school in Independence, living in her boarding house room, existing in a sort of pleasant limbo where nothing ever really changed. "I do not think I want to go back to that life," she said slowly. "Not anymore." "What do you want?" Thomas asked quietly. Adelaide turned to look at him, at this man who had saved her life and stolen her heart without even trying. "I want something real, something that matters. I want to wake up each morning with a purpose, to work hard and build something lasting. I want to stop hiding who I am and what I want." "And what do you want, Adelaide?" Thomas asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. She met his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. "I want you," she said simply. "I want a life with you if you will have me." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Then he reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle as they entwined with hers. "I have wanted that since the moment I saw you hiding in the cottonwoods," he said. "I was just afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or too complicated or too much." "It probably is all of those things," Adelaide said, tears suddenly blurring her vision. "But I do not care. I spent my whole life being careful and following the rules and doing what was expected of me. And where did it get me? Hiding from a murderer and running for my life. I am done being careful, Thomas. I want to live." Thomas raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so sweet and old-fashioned that it made Adelaide's heart ache. "Then we will live," he said. "Together, if that is what you want." "It is all I want," Adelaide whispered. Thomas pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, and Adelaide leaned into him, feeling safe and cherished and home. They sat like that, as the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge, not speaking, just being together. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of quiet happiness underscored by nervous anticipation. Adelaide and Thomas no longer hid their growing feelings, though they were careful to remain proper under Dan and Margaret's roof. They held hands when they walked, sat close together at meals, and spent their evenings talking about the future they would build together. Thomas told her about his plans for the ranch, how he wanted to expand the herd and maybe add some horses for breeding. Adelaide talked about her dream of starting a small school, teaching the children of ranch families who lived too far from town for regular schooling. "We could build a room onto the house," Thomas suggested. "Big enough for a dozen students or so. You could teach them reading and writing and arithmetic. And you could teach them about ranching and animals and living off the land," Adelaide added, her eyes shining. "A complete education, practical and academic both." They wove their dreams together like threads in a tapestry, creating a picture of a life that was fuller and richer than anything Adelaide had imagined before. Then, on a bright morning in late November, a rider arrived from Independence with word from Marshal Crawford. Wallace Hendricks had been arrested. He was in custody, awaiting trial in Kansas City, where Crawford had arranged for a change of venue to ensure a fair hearing. Adelaide felt her knees go weak with relief. "It is over," she whispered. "Not quite," Dan said, reading the rest of the message. "Crawford needs Adelaide to come to Kansas City in 2 weeks to give her testimony. But Hendricks' men are still looking for her, trying to intimidate potential witnesses. Crawford recommends she stay hidden until the trial." "Then she stays here," Margaret said firmly. "We have plenty of room and we love having her." Adelaide looked at Thomas, who nodded his agreement. "If Dan and Maggie do not mind, I would like to stay too, at least until the trial is over and we know Adelaide is truly safe." "We would not have it any other way," Dan said, so they waited, and the days turned into a pleasant routine. Adelaide helped Margaret with the household tasks and started planning the curriculum for her future school. Thomas worked the ranch with Dan and began making plans for the improvements he wanted to make to his own land. And in the evenings, they courted. That was the only word for it, Adelaide thought. Thomas courted her with a gentle persistence that made her fall more in love with him each day. He brought her wildflowers he found on the range. He taught her to ride better, patient and encouraging as she gained confidence in the saddle. He told her stories of his childhood and listened with genuine interest to her memories of growing up in Baltimore. One evening, about a week before they were due to leave for Kansas City, Thomas asked Adelaide to walk with him. They strolled away from the ranch buildings, following a creek that wound through the property. The November air was crisp, but not yet bitter, and the last light of sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Thomas led her to a spot where the creek widened into a small pool, the water clear and still. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Adelaide, I know we have not known each other very long," he began. "Just a few weeks. But in that time, you have become the most important person in my life. I cannot imagine my future without you in it." Adelaide's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Thomas, let me finish," he said with a gentle smile. "I know you have been through a terrible ordeal. I know your life has been turned upside down and you are still finding your footing, so I am not asking you to make any decisions right now. I just need you to know how I feel." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it out to her. In the fading light, Adelaide saw it was a ring, simple but beautiful, with a small blue stone set in silver. "This was my mother's," Thomas said. "My father gave it to her when they got engaged. I would like you to have it if you will take it. Not as an engagement ring, not yet, but as a promise. A promise that when you are ready, when all of this is behind us and you have had time to think about what you really want, I will ask you properly. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." Adelaide looked at the ring, then at Thomas's earnest face and felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "I do not need time to think," she said, her voice shaking. "I know what I want, Thomas. I want you. I want the life we have been planning together. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to build a home with you and raise children with you and grow old with you." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Are you certain?" "Adelaide, you do not have to. I am certain," Adelaide said firmly. She held out her left hand. "Ask me properly." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face, transforming it from handsome to beautiful. He dropped to one knee in the grass beside the creek, still holding her hand. "Adelaide Kane, will you marry me?" "Yes," Adelaide said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. For a long moment, they just held each other, and Adelaide felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. This was where she belonged. This was home. Then Thomas tilted her face up and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Adelaide kissed him back, pouring all her love and hope and joy into it, and thought that after all the terror and uncertainty of the past few weeks, she had finally found her happy ending. When they returned to the ranch house hand in hand, Margaret took one look at them and let out a whoop of joy. "I knew it. Dan, they are engaged." Dan emerged from his study with a broad smile. "Well, it is about time. I was starting to wonder if Thomas was ever going to get around to asking." They celebrated with a special dinner and a bottle of wine Dan had been saving for a special occasion. Margaret immediately started planning the wedding, suggesting they hold it at the ranch in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming. "If that is all right with you two, of course," she added. "It is your wedding." "It sounds perfect," Adelaide said, squeezing Thomas's hand under the table. The happiness of the engagement carried them through the journey to Kansas City for the trial. Thomas insisted on accompanying Adelaide, unwilling to let her out of his sight even with Marshal Crawford and several deputies providing escort. The trial itself was mercifully brief. Adelaide gave her testimony clearly and calmly, describing exactly what she had seen the night Samuel Turner was murdered. Wallace Hendricks' expensive lawyers tried to discredit her, suggesting she was mistaken or had been put up to it, but Adelaide stood firm. She looked Hendricks straight in the eye as she recounted watching him pull the trigger, and she saw the moment he knew he was finished. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Hendricks was sentenced to hang for Turner's murder, with additional charges pending for the rustling operation and other crimes Crawford had uncovered during his investigation. As they led Hendricks away, he looked back at Adelaide with pure hatred in his eyes. But she did not flinch. She had Thomas beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers, and Hendricks could not hurt her anymore. They were married in April of 1874, in Dan and Margaret Robertson's ranch yard with the wildflowers in full bloom just as Margaret had predicted. The ceremony was small but perfect, attended by Dan and Margaret, a few neighboring ranchers, and Marshal Jack Crawford, who had become a friend. Adelaide wore a simple white dress Margaret had helped her sew, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Thomas wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed, his dark eyes shining as he watched her walk toward him. The circuit preacher performed the ceremony under the vast prairie sky, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Adelaide with a tenderness that made her eyes fill with happy tears. They spent their wedding night at the Robertson Ranch before heading back to Thomas's land, which was now their land, to begin their married life together. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, but a joyful one. Adelaide learned the rhythms of ranch life, discovering that she had a natural aptitude for managing the household and the business side of the operation. Thomas taught her more about riding and handling livestock, and she taught him about keeping proper records and managing their finances more efficiently. Together they built the addition to the house for Adelaide School, and by the fall of 1874 she had 6 students, children of neighboring ranchers who were hungry for education. She taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and history in the mornings, while Thomas taught them practical skills like horsemanship and animal husbandry in the afternoons. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch they had expanded, watching the sun set over their land and talk about their day. Those were Adelaide's favorite moments, the quiet intimacy of sharing their lives with each other. She became pregnant in the winter of 1875, and Thomas was beside himself with joy and worry. He fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less, until Adelaide finally had to tell him firmly that she was pregnant, not made of glass. Their son was born in September of 1875, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him James Thomas Carson, and from the moment he entered the world, he had both his parents wrapped around his tiny finger. Adelaide discovered that she loved being a mother almost as much as she loved being a wife and teacher. She would sit in the rocking chair Thomas had made for her, nursing James and watching Thomas work in the yard, and feel a contentment so deep it almost frightened her. 2 years later, their daughter was born, a tiny girl with blonde hair and her father's dark eyes. They named her Sarah Margaret Carson, after both their mothers. Sarah was quieter than her brother had been, more observant, and she seemed to absorb the world around her with solemn intensity. The ranch prospered. Thomas expanded the herd and began breeding horses as he had dreamed, developing a reputation for producing quality stock. Adelaide's school grew to accommodate 12 students, and she had to hire a young woman from Independence to help with the teaching. They stayed in touch with Dan and Margaret, visiting several times a year and hosting them on their ranch as well. Marshall Crawford stopped by whenever he was in the area, always welcome at their table. The network of friends and neighbors they built became like family, looking out for each other in the way of frontier communities. Adelaide never returned to Independence to teach. The town held too many bad memories, and besides, her life was here now, on this land with this man and these children. She sometimes thought about the frightened woman she had been that night behind the rain barrel, running for her life with no idea where to turn. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The Adelaide she had become was strong and capable, able to handle whatever life threw at her. She could ride as well as most men, shoot a rifle when needed to protect the livestock from predators, deliver a calf in a difficult birth, and nurse her family through illness. She was a teacher, a rancher's wife, a mother, a woman who had built a life she loved through courage and determination. But none of it would have been possible without Thomas. He was still her safety, still her home, the rock on which she had built this new life. He loved her with a steady, enduring devotion that never wavered, and she loved him the same way. When James was 5 and Sarah was 3, Adelaide became pregnant again. This time it was twins, boys who came squalling into the world on a hot summer day in 1880. They named them Daniel, after Dan Robertson, and Samuel, after Samuel Turner, the man whose death had brought Adelaide and Thomas together. The house seemed to burst at the seams with 4 children, but Thomas simply added more rooms, expanding the structure to accommodate their growing family. Adelaide had to reduce her teaching to part-time, focusing on her own children and a few older students who came several days a week. Life was busy and chaotic and absolutely full, and Adelaide would not have changed a single moment of it. On a cool autumn evening in 1882, Adelaide and Thomas stood on their porch watching their children play in the yard. James, now 7, was teaching his younger siblings how to rope a practice post. Sarah, at 5, was more interested in the wildflowers growing near the fence. The twins, rambunctious 2-year-olds, were getting into everything with gleeful determination. "You ever think about that night?" Adelaide asked quietly. "The night you found me hiding in the cottonwoods." Thomas slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Sometimes. I think about how close I came to riding right past without stopping, how different everything would be if I had not heard you." "I think about it too," Adelaide said. "I was so frightened. I thought my life was over, and in a way it was. That old life ended that night." "And a new one began," Thomas said. "A better one," Adelaide agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching James successfully rope the post while Sarah cheered and the twins tried to grab the rope. "I found more than safety with you, Thomas. I found myself. The person I was always meant to be." "I found that too," Thomas said softly. "Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to build something real, something lasting." They stood in comfortable silence, and Adelaide thought about the journey that had brought them here. The terror and flight, the kindness of strangers who became friends, the slow building of trust and love, the life they had created together from nothing but determination and hope. No regrets. Thomas asked, and Adelaide knew he was not just asking about that night but about all of it. The hardships and challenges of ranch life, the isolation, the constant work, all of it. "Not a single one," Adelaide said firmly. She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "You are my home, Thomas Carson. You always will be." Thomas kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of the love that had only deepened over the years. When they pulled apart, Adelaide saw her whole world reflected in his dark eyes. Past, present, and future, all bound together by the choice they had made to love each other. As the sun set over the prairie they had claimed as their own, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Adelaide felt the last shadow of that terrified woman fade away completely. She was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. She was home. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of the seasons. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and dreams. James proved to have his father's gift with horses and announced at age 10 that he wanted to run the ranch someday. Sarah discovered a love of books that rivaled her mother's and spent hours in Adelaide's small library, reading everything she could find. The twins were inseparable troublemakers who kept both their parents constantly on their toes. Daniel was the planner, always thinking 3 steps ahead, while Samuel was the impulsive one who leaped without looking. Together, they were a force of nature that tested Adelaide's patience and made Thomas laugh. Adelaide's school continued to thrive, and she found herself teaching not just academic subjects, but life skills to the young women who came to her. She taught them that education was power, that they could choose their own paths, that being a wife and mother did not mean giving up on their own dreams and ambitions. Many of her students went on to become teachers themselves, or to run businesses alongside their husbands, or to advocate for their communities. Adelaide took quiet pride in knowing she had helped shape a generation of strong, capable women. Thomas's reputation as a horse breeder grew, and people came from as far away as Kansas and Colorado to purchase his stock. He never forgot where he had come from, though, and he was always willing to help neighboring ranchers who fell on hard times, extending credit or trading work for payment. Together, Adelaide and Thomas became pillars of their community, They hosted community gatherings at their ranch. Adelaide organized a lending library that traveled between the scattered homesteads, and Thomas helped form a cooperative that allowed smaller ranchers to pool their resources and get better prices for their cattle. In 1885, Adelaide received word that Wallace Hendricks had died in prison, his health broken by years of confinement. She felt no satisfaction in the news, only a distant sadness for the waste of a life that could have been used for good instead of evil. That evening, she and Thomas took a long walk together, something they still did as often as they could manage despite the demands of ranch and family. "It really is over now," Thomas said as they paused by the creek where he had proposed to her 11 years earlier. "That chapter of our lives is completely closed." "It was over a long time ago," Adelaide said. "The moment I stopped being afraid and started building a life instead of just surviving, that was when it truly ended." She looked around at the land they had claimed and improved, at the house they had expanded to hold their growing family, at the corrals full of fine horses, and the fields where cattle grazed. This was what they had built from those terrifying beginnings: a legacy, a home, a family, a life worth living. When Adelaide turned 40 in 1891, she and Thomas had been married for 17 years. Their children were growing up. James was 16 and working the ranch full-time alongside his father. Sarah was 14 and had announced her intention to become a teacher like her mother. And the twins were 11 and already showing signs of the men they would become. Thomas, at 43, had a few threads of silver in his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting at the sun. But to Adelaide, he was as handsome as the day she had met him. More so, because now every line and weathering told a story of their life together. For her birthday, Thomas took her on a trip, leaving the children in the capable care of Margaret Robertson. They traveled to Denver, staying in a real hotel, eating in restaurants and attending a play at the Opera House. It was the first time in years they had been completely alone together, and Adelaide discovered that she and Thomas still had plenty to talk about when the conversation was not interrupted by children or ranch business. On their last night in Denver, as they sat in their hotel room looking out over the gaslit streets, Thomas took Adelaide's hand. "I have been thinking about what you said when I proposed," he said. "About wanting to wake up next to me every morning and fall asleep in my arms every night, about growing old together." "I remember," Adelaide said softly. "We are doing it," Thomas said. "We are growing old together. And every morning when I wake up and see you beside me, I still cannot quite believe how lucky I am." "I am the lucky one," Adelaide said. "You gave me a life I never could have imagined. You gave me freedom and safety and love. You gave me a home." "We gave each other those things," Thomas corrected gently. "That is what love is, Adelaide. Not one person saving another, but two people building something together that neither could create alone." Adelaide thought about that, about the truth of it. Yes, Thomas had rescued her that night in the cottonwoods, but she had given him something too: purpose, partnership, a reason to turn his solitary existence into a full and vibrant life. They had saved each other in all the ways that mattered. "I love you," she said simply. "More now than I did 17 years ago, and I will love you more 17 years from now than I do today." Thomas pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "That is all I need to hear." They returned to the ranch renewed and refreshed, ready to face whatever the future held. And the future held plenty. Weddings as their children grew up and married, grandchildren who filled the house with noise and laughter, the continued growth of their ranch and Adelaide's school, the slow and steady building of a legacy that would outlast them both. James married at 22, choosing a smart and capable young woman named Elizabeth, who proved to be as good at ranching as he was. They built a house on the Carson land and began raising their own family, working the ranch alongside Thomas and eventually taking over more and more of the daily operations. Sarah pursued her teaching career, though she stayed close to home, eventually taking over Adelaide's school entirely so her mother could focus on the growing number of grandchildren. She married later, at 26, to a lawyer from Kansas City who was willing to move to Missouri for her. They built a house in Independence, which had cleaned up considerably since Wallace Hendricks' reign of terror, and Sarah taught at the new public school while still helping with her mother's rural education program. The twins went into business together, starting a freight company that transported goods between the ranch communities and the larger towns. They remained close to home, building houses on adjacent properties and maintaining the habit of finishing each other's sentences that had developed in childhood. By the time Thomas and Adelaide celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1904, they had 12 grandchildren and a ranch that sprawled across thousands of acres. They had built something that would last for generations, a legacy of hard work and integrity and love. But more than that, they had built a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. They still held hands when they walked. They still found time to sit together on the porch in the evenings and watch the sunset. They still looked at each other with the same love and wonder they had felt in those early days when Adelaide was learning to trust that safety could be real and permanent. On a golden afternoon in September of 1905, Adelaide and Thomas sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Adelaide was 64 now, her dark blonde hair streaked liberally with silver. Thomas was 67, his face weathered and lined but his eyes still sharp and full of life. "You remember what I told you the night we met?" Adelaide asked, taking his hand in hers. "I said I was not ready to die." "I remember," Thomas said. "I am still not ready," Adelaide said with a smile. "There is still too much life to live, too much love to give. I want to see these grandchildren grow up. I want to celebrate 50 years of marriage with you. I want to keep building this life we have made." "Then we will," Thomas said simply. "We will take every day we are given and fill it with as much living and loving as we can." And they did. They lived to see all their grandchildren grow to adulthood, to celebrate their golden wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends, to witness the turn of the century and the slow modernization of the frontier they had helped settle. When Thomas finally passed away in the winter of 1918, at the age of 80, he died peacefully in his sleep with Adelaide by his side. They had been married for 44 years, and Adelaide had spent more than half her life loving this man who had saved her and stood by her and built a world with her. Adelaide lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren who were just beginning to arrive. She spent those years writing down the story of her life, wanting future generations to know where they had come from, what they had survived, how love and courage had built something lasting from moments of terror and desperation. She wrote about the night she hid behind the rain barrel, about Thomas appearing out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray. She wrote about falling in love slowly and then all at once, about building a home in the wilderness, about raising children and teaching students and creating a legacy. But mostly she wrote about Thomas, about the man who had become her safety and her home, who had loved her with a devotion that never wavered, who had shown her that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive if you were brave enough to reach for it. When Adelaide died in her sleep in the spring of 1923, at the age of 82, She was buried beside Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood around the grave, and her eldest granddaughter read from the memoir Adelaide had written. I was a woman running from danger when he found me. I was terrified and alone with no hope for the future. Thomas gave me safety when I needed it most, but more than that, he gave me a home. Not just a house or a place to live, but a home in the truest sense. A place where I belonged, where I was loved, where I could be completely myself. He was my safety and my home, and I was his. We built a life together that was richer and fuller than anything I could have imagined in those dark moments when I thought my life was over. It was not over. It was just beginning. The words drifted across the prairie wind, carrying Adelaide's story to the land she had loved, the home she had built, the family she had raised. And in the sunset that painted the sky gold and crimson, in the wildflowers that bloomed on the hillside, in the strong hands and brave hearts of the generations that followed, Adelaide and Thomas lived on. Their story had started with danger and fear, with a woman hiding in the darkness and a cowboy who chose to help rather than ride on by. But it had become so much more, a testament to the power of love, the importance of courage, the possibility of building something beautiful from the ashes of destruction. The ranch still operated, run now by James's children and grandchildren. Adelaide's school had evolved into a foundation that provided education to rural communities across 3 states. The values Thomas and Adelaide had lived by, honesty, hard work, compassion, and unwavering devotion to family, had been passed down through the generations and remained strong. On summer evenings, when the grandchildren gathered at the old ranch house, they would sit on the porch where Adelaide and Thomas had sat so many times before. They would watch the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold, and they would tell the story of how it all began, with a woman hiding from danger and a cowboy who became her safety and her home. And the love story that had started in terror and darkness, that had grown through faith and perseverance, that had blossomed into something that would last for generations, lived on in every retelling. It lived on in the land they had claimed, in the family they had raised, in the legacy they had built together. Thomas and Adelaide Carson had found each other in the darkest of moments and had created a light that would never go out. They had proved that love could triumph over fear, that courage could overcome danger, and that 2 people committed to each other could build something that would last forever. Their story was complete, their ending happy, their legacy secure. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.